Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the LSA Scholarly. My name is Sarah Hercula. I'm an applied linguist from Missouri University of Science and Technology, and I have the pleasure of being the session chair for this session today. Speaker or group of speakers will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 minutes of Q&A. And I will go ahead and introduce each of them at the beginning of their 30-minute segment. So we'll go ahead and begin with Maura O'Leary, and Richard Stockwell. Their paper is entitled Skills-Based Grading, a Novel Approach to Teaching Formal Semantics.
Okay, thanks very much. Our presentation today is about skills-based grading in formal semantics. And we'll start with the foil for our presentation, which is traditional grading. So if you take a course in a North American education system, you can usually expect the course to be composed of a series of assessments. So that would be homework assignments, in-class quizzes, examinations, maybe also participation and attendance. And every part of every assessment contributes a proportion of your final grade. This forces you as a student to progress along a uniform timeline. You have to keep up with the class. If you get a question wrong on homework 1, those points are lost to you and can never be recovered. Even if on a subsequent homework or in the final exam, you get a very similar question correct. A final feature of traditional grading is that it often has partial credits, which is approximately then credit for partial understanding, whereby if you score 8 out of 10 on a question, it's because you were nearly right, but you could go through an entire course doing that and get a B grade, despite never fully showing that you understand anything completely. What we'll be talking about today, in contrast, is skills-based grading, whereby the components of the course are skills, which form a list distributed to students at the beginning of the course. And each assessment exercise, each exercise on any assessment provides an opportunity to demonstrate proficiency in some skills. After a skill is taught, it's offered on the homework of that week, and at least once subsequently on another homework or on an examination. Each attempt is marked as not yet proficient, approaching proficiency, or proficient. Only proficient counts for your grade. So there's no punishment for getting an answer wrong. And approaching proficiency gives you an indication that you are nearly there, but doesn't count towards your grade. So only fully correct answers are marked as proficient. There's no partial credit in this system. So now to directly compare the two, in a traditional system, the course is composed of a series of assignments, each contributing its proportion to your final grade. Whereas in the skills-based system, it's the skills that make up the course. And as you tick off the skills, your grade builds up as you go along. Whereas in the traditional system, you're forced to progress along a uniform timeline. In skills-based grading, you have multiple opportunities. So if you don't get it right the first time, there are subsequent opportunities to make up that skill mark. In this sense, skills-based grading is more generous, but skills-based grading is not just a freebie. It's more rigorous in that it requires you to demonstrate full proficiency to get the point for a particular skill. So there's no partial credit in this system. Skills-based grading-like systems have been used in secondary and higher education settings many times before. As far as we're aware, Zero et al. The first to report using such a system in linguistics, and they did so for phonetics and phonology. Today, we'll talk about implementing skills-based grading in semantics, where the novelty here might be that where semantics has mathematical or algorithmic type skills that have a clear right or wrong answer, it also involves more abstract philosophical skills, especially as you tend towards pragmatics, and skills requiring knowledge as a language user. So you might have to come up with original examples or identify aspects of meanings of sentences. And we'll show that skills-based grading works also with this, with the more abstract and the language user type skills, in addition to the concrete mathematical ones. So our course was Semantics 1, taught at the University of California, Los Angeles, to 29 students who'd already taken an Introduction to Linguistics course and an Introductory Syntax course. Two potentially caveats are that the course was taught online, meaning that we didn't have the sort of nimbleness to be able to conduct quick in-class quizzes, for example, and interpersonal connections with the students were weaker than they would have been in person. And the course was also very intensive. It was only 6 weeks long in a summer session. So this compressed timeline meant that we didn't have the scope for doing a midterm, for example. Skills-wise, our course was composed of 47 skills that we identified at the outset, grouped into 12 groups. And for the most part, one demonstration of a skill earned you 1 percentage point towards your final grade. That meant that some of the skills therefore required multiple demonstrations. So we see on this slide our 12 skill groups and their relative weights in the final grade. And over the next few slides, we'll zoom in on 3 of them to give you some examples of the list of skills and a question. So our first example is sentence relationships. There are 5 skills in this skill group. The first one, identify implicature and maxim. 4 demonstrations were required there, 1 for each of Grice's maxims. And doing each one of those 4 got you 1 point to your final grade. Then 4.2 to 5, other logical relationships between sentences. And on this slide, then we have an example question. So to identify an implicature and the maxim that generates it. And then over on the right, we have the sort of grading box to be marked as not yet proficient or approaching proficiency, or proficient, only proficient, then counting towards the final grade. The other 2 giving indications of how the answer was doing. Then there's a second example of a skill group, lambda calculus. So this skill group involved semantic types, denotations, and playing with them in derivations. And here's another example question then to calculate the semantic type. And again, the skills grading box to indicate the level of proficiency. This slide has an example of an advanced analysis question. So the 11 core skill groups, if you showed proficiency in all of those skills, you'd have landed yourself on a B grade. To advance to an A grade, you needed to do approximately 1 of these kinds of questions each week. So an extra step beyond to count for an A grade, where the point here is that the students take some information that they've learned in class, they've been presented with the disjunction operator, but then are asked to think more about how well that aligns with the meaning of natural language English or in the context in 3. So for the rest of this presentation, we'll evaluate skills-based grading as we applied it in our course. As we went along, we collected quantitative data from weekly grade updates. So we have a snapshot of how the students were doing week by week, and we've got data to present from that. And also qualitative data from surveys that we took at the middle and the end of the course. And we'll present the comments in blue bubbles for positive ones and red bubbles for negative ones. Broadly, from this first blue bubble, students said that they quite liked the system. They said it was transparent, they'd rather more courses did it, and that it provided some flexibility for students who might not do so well in the traditional system. And on this slide, we see that students gave the system sort of 6 out of 7 for liking it. And on the next slide, they also understood it, getting high scores out of 7 for understanding of the system. So now what we'll do for the rest of the presentation, that was the sort of broad brush evaluation. And now handing over to Maura, we'll tie the data that we collected more specifically to evaluating the benefits that have been claimed for skills-based grading in the literature by Zero et al. And outside of linguistics. At the end, we'll talk about the applicability, particularly to semantics for the more abstract and language user skills and what we do differently next time. But handing over to Maura now, she'll begin with improved student learning.
So the first benefit we want to talk about is improved student learning. So skills-based grading better prepares students for advanced courses in that they have to fully demonstrate each skill rather than briefly remembering it from lecture and then partially regurgitating it on an immediate homework. On top of that, skills build on one another. So even when an easy skill is mastered early in the course, it's not forgotten. It's just still in use in other skills. In semantics, for instance, we see propositional logic then used during predicate logic, which is then again used during lambda calculus. So the skills are still in use, even though the students may feel like they have checked off that skill. These things all in turn become a better measurement of student learning because we're grading here for complete mastery rather than partial understanding, as Richard discussed, or even guessing, which is, as we can all agree, not what we're aiming for in terms of what our students are doing. Students feel these benefits and they say that they think that they like how this system makes you think more about the individual constituent skills that comprise the course. And they think that their understanding of the material is better as well. They also feel that this is an effective and accurate way to assess knowledge. Now, some students were concerned about being able to delay points, which comes along with having multiple opportunities. They worried that if they could put it off, they would put it off, and they feared getting complacent. However, we didn't actually see this happening in the class. In fact, grades increased very evenly throughout the course, both on average and by student. So we see here that some students would take a week and not do a homework assignment there, and their grade wouldn't increase that week. But overall, for nearly all the students, we see a very steady climb throughout the course in terms of how they earned their grade. Another note on grading before we move on from that is that the additive nature of skills-based grading perturbed some of the students. So the way it works is that they start with a base score, and then every time they demonstrate a skill, they add a little bit to their final grade until they reach the end of the course, at which point they could have earned fully 100%, in fact, several times over, or they could have stopped somewhere along the way and not earned the rest of those skills. Therefore, near the beginning of class, as this student has said, it will report that you have a terrible grade because you're getting 25% total earned thus far, or something along those lines. This led students to feel some confusion about where their grades would be, and they felt they would have to guess what their end grade might be. But we felt that perhaps including the previous graphs in the syllabus might be enough to allay such fears as these. The second benefit that we want to discuss is effective study. So once a skill is marked as proficient in this system, there's no need for a student to ever demonstrate that skill again. This helps students focus their efforts. They say things like, I can focus on things I need more practice on rather than things I already mastered. Or I like that you can allocate more time into working on the parts you have trouble with. This in turn incentivizes a growth mindset that engages reattempting skills that were initially failed. And students say it turns no's into not yets, and that there's no cost for trying, which seems like a very positive outlook to have about your learning. This is in comparison to the sometimes demoralizing subtractive grading. So students note that in traditional grading, once you lose points for something, you can never really recover them. And in this system, it's nice that they can't be penalized for being wrong. On the note of being penalized, a third benefit is that there is lower stress in this system. So until the final, there's always another chance to demonstrate a skill, which in turn leads to less stress, less fear, and less time pressure. This means that students feel a relief of stress because they have multiple attempts at any given thing. And the fact that they wouldn't be penalized very directly alleviated stress for them, and they felt like it encouraged them to try again. This wasn't necessarily an important feature for every bit of content, though. So some skill groups needed more opportunities than others. This skill groups roughly divide the course by different topic. So if we see, for instance, in word meaning, this sort of brown bar along the top of this graph, they earned most of their points right off the beginning. This involves things like talking about definitions adequacy. If they had had to stop earning points immediately right after their first week learning that, they probably would have been fine. They had earned around 85% of their points already. But we see for many of these skills a sharp increase after the first week. So that means that students didn't necessarily have the ability to earn all of the points their first week that this material was taught, as is often requested of them in traditional grading, but in fact gained these skills over time. In fact, we see a really steady increase throughout a lot of these skills, that they continued to gain these skills over time. This is a stark contrast with traditional grading, which is generally testing a student on a certain topic the week it was taught, and then maybe again at a midterm and final. But if we were to evaluate students only in a week following a topic, we would note a significant decrease in their total grades. So the light blue bars here show if their grades were only from the first week that any given material was taught. And then the dark blue bars show their actual grades. Now, this might be in some way tied in their finals. It would probably raise their grade a little bit, but we find that this skill system actually very directly shows a way to evaluate the total number of skills that students actually learned. We just don't care about exactly when they picked them up. And one more note on opportunities is that some students were concerned about the number of opportunities they would get. So they say if they haven't mastered a skill, they're stressed about wondering how many opportunities they'll have left to demonstrate it. And they'd say it was better if we could know how many chances that we would have. Note that we did tell them how many chances they would have in the syllabus, but we feel that in the future, we could remind them a little bit more. In fact, by the end, we had ended up giving them 3 times as many opportunities for each given skill as they would need to be able to get a complete 100% in the class. But we feel that in the second edition of this course, we'd be much better off because we can offer students an exact description of where exactly each skill opportunity will occur on which assessment, and they can feel a lot more security about knowing what the landscape of the class is going to look like. The last benefit that we want to talk about is equity. So life is complicated, and there's a lot of things that can sort of slow you down from doing your best in a class or in a homework or on a test. For instance, they're universal things like illness or grief or global pandemics. And this system offers no penalty for temporary setbacks. So students feel they got second chances when outside circumstances hindered their week's grades. And they felt very comforted to know that nothing could harm those grades. This is in comparison to traditional grading, where often one missed homework can completely wreck your grade. A bonus to this is that there's no need for instructors to make judgment calls about what justifies an extension. So you don't have to deal with that moment of, how do I let this student complete the homework when they can't complete it at the right time? You can just move forward and say, there are so many more opportunities for you to gain these skills. There's no lost points from you not completing this homework at a time when you couldn't. A place where this really comes into play is that it's particularly fair to students facing structural and institutional disadvantages. So students may not enter the class with the same background, and they might take a little longer to catch up to their peers. It's also possible that some of these students are more likely to experience external stressors, which lead to missed classes or missed assignments. For instance, at UCLA, where we taught this class, 32% of undergraduate students are first generation. 36% are transfers, and 26% learned English as a second language. Our students noted that this was a more fair system. They said that this system would have less exam-induced stress for students in poorer living conditions and students in different time zones, which was especially important while we were teaching this online class during the pandemic, where our students were located all over the world. We finally want to return to the idea that skills-based grading is well suited for semantics and not just phonology. So we know from phonology that skills-based grading works well with concrete skills where you have a correct answer or maybe 1 or 2 correct answers. But we've also found that it works equally well with abstract or more philosophical skills where there are infinite possible answers, and also on skills based on using knowledge of meaning as a language user, for instance, creating examples on your own. In fact, we found that these skill types increased very equally over time and also all very steadily over time. So this represents the percent of points earned within each of these types of skills. And it seems that they all follow a fairly regular increase throughout the weeks of this course. So to summarize these benefits, we see improved student learning. We see effective study in that it clearly labels content to be learned, and it allows students to move on from skills they've mastered. In addition, it lowers stress because there's no way for students to permanently hurt their grade, and it promotes equity in the classroom. It also works well for a wide variety of content, which is something that we're really adding to this conversation here. These bubbles right here really represent what we felt were the largest picture from our students' discussion, in that it's quite clear what's expected of them, it's self-paced, it helps them to not lose points, and it also causes less stress because of that. We're planning on repeating this. So in the future, we have a few things we need to consider. For instance, students asked for more homework opportunities to demonstrate the skills. But we think that some time pressure is useful. It helps value each opportunity and it helps disincentivize guessing. It's possible that showing them when the opportunities will come to them will alleviate this to some degree, but we're going to have to find some balance. On the same note, it's difficult to make repeated instances of simple skills adequately different, which sometimes means that the exercises got harder over time without us intending that to happen. Students did note this, saying that for certain skills, each subsequent time it was offered on the homework, it seemed a little bit harder. And this is just an artifact of having to repeat simple skills in a different way each time. In addition, we would probably start labeling skills on lecture slides and handouts as they are taught, so that it's very easy for students to match a skill along with the lecture materials when they are studying. Finally, we would add something cumulative and mandatory to build to, either a final paper or a mandatory exam, so that we can sort of guarantee that students both stay engaged and also that we have a complete thing for them to work towards and use these skills on. And this isn't just something that we want as instructors, the students actually asked for it. They said that they thought the final should have been mandatory. It would have been a good indicator of where they understood, whether they understood the course content or not. Overall, though, this is definitely an experience we would repeat, and we are highly recommending skills-based grading. Thank you. And you can get the slides and other materials at that link there.
Thank you so much. We're on to about a 10-minute or so question session for this session. And I believe Richard has been answering some by typing them. So some of them have already been answered, but we'll take a few of these live as well. Brad Hoot asks, does this system require creating many more assessments? That is, if students have multiple chances to demonstrate skills, are you creating multiple times as many assignments?
So we felt that we did end up doing that, but we were also new to this system and we were running this very, very condensed course online. So I think that it doesn't necessarily need that over time. And certainly Zara et al. Actually note a significant decrease in their time both creating assignments and also grading assignments. But we kind of found that these were longer assignments, not necessarily more assignments, but I guess that depends on how you break it up. But I would imagine that with the second go, we could really cut it down. So yes and no. I'm sorry, that's not a completely satisfying answer. Richard, feel free to jump in if you feel like you have something I didn't say.
Another question being posed, for mastered skills, is there a way to return to them? Just because a skill is mastered at one point in the semester, how do you make sure those skills are retained over time? Is there a way to build in spaced retrieval?
That is a great question. This is definitely one of the things that I think people would immediately see as a potential issue with this course. There are a couple ways to make sure that you don't lose skills over time. So the first one, which is what we use, is that we just built skills into other skills. So they built on one another. So for instance, that you would use propositional logic and predicate logic. So we weren't worried about them losing that skill because they were just applying it in a new context. However, there are a couple ways you could go about this. One, you could have some sort of mandatory final or final project in that they would have to use those skills there. So they would have to make sure that they held onto them and use them one more time for a specific part of their grade. Third, you could also delay having some opportunities. So you could say, you need to do a simple version of this, and that's one skill, and that will be offered within the first half of the course. And then you have a complex version of that skill, which will only be offered in the second half of the course. So you have, it doesn't inherently built into the system, but there are a lot of ways around it so that you can find, you can sort of find a way to make sure that those skills are retained over time. It's definitely something the system is allowing you to do to an extreme extent.
Just a reminder to our attendees that if you'd like to ask a question, please do so in the Q&A rather than in the chat, because I'm selecting questions from the Q&A for the speakers to answer. Another question, this model shows great compassion for students, which is great. Does this mean that assignments are accepted on a rolling basis? How does this system change the grading experience for instructors?
So this is again somewhere where we saw a difference from what Zara et al. Reported. They found that they reported much lower grading times, I think mostly tied to the fact that it's an all or nothing system. So you're marking students just as proficient, almost proficient, or fully proficient. Sorry, not proficient, almost proficient, and fully proficient. And so that takes a lot of time out of deciding with a group of TAs, for instance, exactly how many points to take off for a certain thing. So I think it reduces time there. But it doesn't mean that there was less grading. In fact, we found that we were grading a lot more because on so many assignments, we wanted to offer a lot of opportunities. Again, one of the many things I think would get better the second time we taught the class. The question you asked about a rolling basis, though, we didn't end up doing that because we wanted to give students answers to the questions in class. We wanted to walk them through the assignments and show them what kind of answers we were looking for, the things they should be seeing in those questions. So we chose to have a due date for the assignments, but our sort of dream for this class is that skills that could be graded easily on sort of an online quiz section, we would just have a large repository of questions that students could attempt anytime they wanted to and earn those skills on their own time, so that they would get a random skill. Let's say they have to fill out a truth table and they just get that skill whenever they want to. So if it's week 1, great. If it's week 10, great. It doesn't matter. They just go on to their online portal and fill that out, get a randomized question, so that we can, semi-guarantee they're not getting the same one as the person sitting next to them, and they can just give it a go whenever they feel ready. That I think would involve a lot better grading for the instructors, but it's possible that this isn't applicable for everybody. I certainly know that we didn't have enough time to enact this before our class.
Okay, another question. This is an awesome system. A question though, if people are allowed to work together on homework, how does this control for when one person on the team disproportionately answers the questions? Without checking the skill on an exam, it seems difficult to know whether an individual student has personally demonstrated the skill.
That's a great question. First of all, it always allows for the addition of an exam. I know that in a lot of some of the classes we read about that use this, they did end up having a traditional exam. We knew that because it was going to be an online class during the pandemic, we weren't going to do that anyways. We were only going to do things that were take home. So we didn't really worry about it in the first place because it would have been the same issue, whether they were doing a skills-based homework together or a regular traditional grading homework together. So we kind of just let it go. There's no reason at all that you couldn't have a portion of your grade marked out for a test. For instance, Zara et al., who did it in phonology, marked off a portion of their grade for a final paper, and then just the rest of the grade is made up with the skills. I know that someone who's using this, a couple of people who are using this at Pomona College are using 50% of their grade for writing and then 50% of their grade based on skills. So there's no reason you can't sort of divide up. You also can do a skills-based exam in person. As for whether it controls whether one person is disproportionately answering the questions, I suppose the best answer I can give is that a single person who's checked off all their skills perhaps wouldn't want to go back to those skills to help a person who hasn't filled them out yet. So they wouldn't want to tackle a new question per se, just to do it for somebody else in a way that they would if they were already completing the skill again themselves. So.
I think we maybe have time for one more. And the other ones that are in here, hopefully Mara and Richard will have time to answer those via typing as we go into the next presentation. So I'll just ask the next one here. Thank you. I wonder how this affected final grade distributions. How do you ensure that student grades have enough separation with skills-based grading? In parentheses, for those of us in institutions that expect assessments to adequately distinguish students and or fit a curve.
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled you asked about distribution because I have a slide for that. Thanks to our statistical consultant who pulled this together for us. So our actual grades did have a pretty wide distribution. I realize that this isn't necessarily a fit bell curve on this pink line, which is our actual grades, but it is a better distribution than I saw when I taught this same class with the traditional grades, because I know myself to be a fairly easy grader. So this is a satisfactory distribution from my point of view. As for achieving a certain distribution intentionally, I don't know how this grade system would approach that. I'm not super familiar with all the curving techniques because I've never taught with curving techniques myself. So I'm not actually sure whether that's something that you could apply to the system, although I imagine that you could just, I suppose, attach a curve to the final grade and then use it.
You could do the you could curve based on, you could treat this as raw scores and curve as you would normally any other course, but you would then lose the sort of motivating build up of your grade that a point really counts for a point. But I suppose that's something that is lost in a curving system to start with, regardless of whether you do traditional or skills-based.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Awesome presentation to get us started. Let's go ahead and move on to our second presentation today. The authors on this presentation are Caitlin Harrigan, Anya Hogeboom, and Leslie Cochran of the College of William and Mary. And they will be giving a talk today entitled A Hands-On Approach to Teaching Introductory Linguistics.
All right, thank you all so much for being here. This is joint work between myself, Anya Hogeboom, and Leslie Cochran, and Leslie will take over about halfway through the presentation. Okay, so we're going to tell you today about our kind of novel hands-on approach to teaching introductory linguistics. Basically what we've done is we've added what we call a workshop section to our intro course, and it's essentially like a lab section that you might see in some other kinds of intro level courses. The workshop section contains a series of hands-on activities or labs. The way that this is structured for us is that we meet once a week for 50 minutes, and this is additional to our regular section meetings. And during this time, students work through some kind of independent activity that introduces an interesting linguistic concept or concepts, as well as some kind of practical skill or skill set. So it's sort of like a little mini hands-on lab where students are kind of working through something independently and coming to some kind of conclusion that we then reinforce with the whole group at the end of the 50-minute block. So just for a little bit of context about our program, so you kind of understand how this fits into our linguistics program at William and Mary. We're an undergraduate focused institution. We graduate about 30 linguistics majors each year. We usually have around 15 students that are actively engaged in research with faculty. And we usually have about 4 or so independent honors theses each year. We also want to preface this by saying that this current structure that we're presenting here works well for the kind of system that we have at William and Mary, but we think that a lot of these activities would translate really well to other kinds of levels too. So they do a really good job in a lot of cases of introducing some kind of basic concept or skill that could be adapted for higher level courses or even early grad students. We also wanted to say that we're very happy to share any of these activities with any of you who are interested in implementing them or just seeing them a little bit more closely. So feel free to send me an email afterwards and I will send you a zip file of kind of all the activities that you can look through. Okay, so in this presentation, we're going to talk about the 3 main goals of our workshop section. So the workshop section allows us to do a better job in our intro course of representing the field of linguistics. It allows us to connect concepts that we cover in the section, so the kind of theoretical linguistics concepts that make up the core of our linguistics course, to different kinds of real-world evidence. And it provides a really nice vehicle for introducing practical skills, both things that are going to come up later in a linguistics major, as well as other kinds of skills outside of the linguistics major. So what we're going to do in this talk is kind of unpack each of these goals and illustrate each of them with a sample workshop. So obviously the full range of our workshops cover a lot of different ground across a lot of different domains, and we're not going to cover all of them here, but we're going to kind of give you a sample of how they work by highlighting 3 of them in connection with each of these goals. Okay, and so I'll start with the first goal here. The workshops allow us to better represent the fields. As you know, linguists deploy a range of empirical and experimental methods in their research, many of which are really difficult to implement in an undergraduate classroom. And in fact, the idea for the workshops kind of came out of this feeling of disconnect that a lot of us had between what we were doing in our research lives and what students were getting exposed to in our intro courses. So what we've done here is essentially come up with a series of sort of carefully crafted activities that represent different kinds of complex research methodologies, but that are sort of pared down to be deployable introductory level activities. So I'm going to give you an example of one of the workshops that we do that I think does a good job of better representing the field than a traditional intro class would, and that's our language acquisition workshop. The language acquisition workshop allows students to discover and reinforce the concept of productivity in language, and it also allows us to cover a couple things that don't necessarily get covered in a traditional intro course. So language acquisition, as well as corpus analysis, and to kind of get your hands on feeling this productivity of language from a self-discovery perspective. Okay, so I'll give you a little snapshot of what students do in this workshop. We start by, of course, introducing them to what is language acquisition, right? We're getting here at how kids acquire their first language. And of course, one way to do language acquisition work is to do studies with children directly. And there's obviously lots of different methods that we have to do this. This is, however, not so feasible in our classroom setting. We can't bring them into the classroom and study them that way, but we can get at language acquisition in another way by doing a corpus analysis. So this allows us to also introduce to students the idea of corpus studies. So corpus, of course, is a database of language output. This could be naturalistic production or written language, things like Twitter and newspaper stories, etc. The corpus that we use for this workshop is ChildS, which is a corpus of child-produced and child-directed language. And what students do is essentially a case study on children's production of the past tense ed morpheme. And so this allows us to answer a couple questions. So it allows us to answer sort of a language acquisition question. What can this tell us about what the child is learning? And it allows us to kind of link back to one of the big themes of the course overall, which is how does looking at what the child is learning here allow us to contribute to our description of the language system overall. Okay, so from here we set up two competing hypotheses about how children might be learning their morphological system. So the first hypothesis is that children are learning essentially by imitation. So maybe they're just memorizing all words, including complex ones individually. So they just have kind of, a lexicon that's full of things like walked, walk, walking, etc. The competing hypothesis here is, of course, that children are learning a productive rule-governed system, that they are hypothesizing a system of words comprised of roots and affixes, and then a set of rules about how those combine. And of course, as linguists, we know that this is the right way to think about this, but the students are still kind of grappling with what this even means. And so, of course, the mental model of that would look something more like this, where you've got your pieces and then you're combining those pieces. Okay, so what do students do? We direct them to ChildS, and we're just going to use the online browsable database. When you click there, you get a list of different databases from different languages. We're going to use the English North America one. You click on that, you get a whole list of different sets of transcripts from different kids across different ages. And essentially what the students are going to be doing here is typing simple commands into the command line down here using the drop-down menu that has a series of different kinds of commands. And we're going to show them how to use a couple different ones. And then they're going to pop some different transcripts in there and output different instances of past tense ed and look for patterns in those. So it's going to look something like this. They're going to choose the relevant command that they need. So combo, for example, is one of the ones we use. They're going to type or copy in the command that we have set up for them. And then ChildS is going to output for them a list of all of the different utterances that have that past tense ed. Their job is then to go through, find all of these and make a list of the unique morphologically inflected words that the child has produced, right? And so they're kind of making a list of those, maybe comparing with neighbors, sort of looking at what do we see when we search in the transcript for our child's past tense ed productions. Once the students have gotten through all of the transcripts that we've assigned them, we come back together as a group and we have them share with us what they found, and then we kind of think through how it maps onto our hypotheses. So we remind them here, we are comparing the hypothesis of imitation to the hypothesis of something like a rule-governed system. And then we have students share, what did you find? And so of course they'll tell us that they found things like played and asked and called and milked and crashed. And we have them we sort of elicit from them, right, that from these kinds of examples, you can't tell if children are imitating or if they're generating, right? Maybe they just heard someone say played and they're saying it back. But students will also find things like blowed and throwed and standed and catched and drawed. And of course, from these cases, we can tell that children aren't imitating because it's unlikely that they've heard these in the environment. And so that leads us to conclude, to really elicit from the students, aha, this is what allows me to see that kids are really learning something that looks like a rule-governed system here. Okay, so this workshop allows us to introduce language acquisition and corpus analysis, which we typically don't have time for in our sections. And it also allows students to discover for themselves, through the lens of language acquisition, this concept of productivity, and then we can kind of reinforce the takeaway. Obviously, this is not the only example of the ways in which our workshop better represents the field of linguistics. We cover lots of other things too, for example, acoustic phonetics, lots of different psycholinguistic experimental methods, discourse analysis. Again, we've got kind of a complete list. If you want access to that, we're happy to send them along your way. The second goal that we feel like our workshop helps us fulfill in this intro course is that it connects the concepts that we talk about in section to different kinds of real world evidence. So if you've taught intro before, you know that building theories in an intro course can feel really abstract for students. It's like we're getting these morphological rules, but sometimes you can tell that they have this sense of like, okay, what does this really mean? Like how does this connect to the way that I'm using language? And so we feel like integrating hands-on methods gives students a way to kind of experience real life evidence for these theories, to really sort of understand what they mean and to take some ownership of them because they've been through the process of discovering them and seeing the kind of application. So again, here I'll give you an example of one of the workshops that we do that we feel like helps satisfy this goal. This is a workshop that we do that is about morphological processing. And what we're looking at here is pseudo-affix effects. So in this workshop, we're using essentially a lexical decision task to illustrate the real-time processing cost of morphological complexity. This workshop allows us to connect morphological theory that we cover in sections to some kind of real world process, the process of retrieving words from your lexicon, recognizing words. It also allows us to introduce lots of things about experimental linguistics, including lexical decision tasks. We use the website SciToolkit, which we use later in my psycholinguistics class, so it's great to get students sort of introduced to that, as well as a whole bunch of different kinds of data analysis skills. Okay, so again, I'll give you a little snapshot of what students do in this workshop. We remind them what they know about the morphology system. So this is a rule-governed system. You've got roots, morphemes, and rules to combine those. And so what we're looking at in the workshop is, can we see evidence of this process in real time? So what we give students is a bunch of materials to set up and run a little bit of tasks. So this includes that is for them to kind of pop into SciToolkit, which is the website that we use. It's web. They pop the code in, they upload a couple other files. Again, we've got step-by-step instructions for each. And then students run the experiment on themselves. So you know, perhaps a lexical decision task, you're going to see a string of letters and press one button if it's a word and a different button if it's not a word. So you might see something like extra and say, yes, it's a word. You might see something like this and say, no, that's not a word. Once students have gone through the entire lexical decision task, SciToolkit will generate for them averages across the conditions. Remember, at this point, students don't know what the conditions are. We haven't told them about what we're doing in the task yet because we want them to be kind of unbiased as they go into doing the task. But they're going to copy those out and then put them into a shared Google Doc that we all access and that we as instructors are then going to copy into Excel to manipulate the data. Once everybody has gotten to this point and we can see because they're putting their data into the Google Doc, we kind of bring everyone back together and we talk about what we did. So we tell them about what we're doing in a lexical decision task. So we're getting here at something like, you know, how long does it take for you to retrieve a word from your lexicon? And as we are showing them calculating these averages, we talk through what the conditions were. So the conditions in our study are as follows. Some of the words are free morphemes, so the no affix condition. So these are things like steak or mountain. Some of the words contain a real affix, so something like runner or decode. And then some of the words are free morphemes that appear to have morphological inflection. So these are called pseudo-affixes, so things like father or resume, right? Father just happens to have that but it doesn't mean like one who fathers. We also, of course, have nonce words to balance things, and we've actually split our nonce words into two conditions as well. So some of our nonce words are just plain old nonce words like nougal or froom, and some of them also appear to have morphological inflection just because it's kind of interesting to see reaction time differences here as well. So something like milger or desundal. Okay, so we talk students through these, and as we're talking through each of the conditions, we are getting the averages and then copying the averages into a kind of pre-made Excel sheet that is all ready to generate a graph that we can kind of do right on the spot, so we can sort of see our bars pop in as we talk about the different conditions and what each of the conditions requires of you as a language processor. And so we see two things here. So this is a sample of data from, I think, last semester. And what we see here are two things. So the first one is, look how fast we are. So even in our very slowest case, we're able to see the word, kind of rifle through our whole lexicon to look for a match, decide if it's a match or not, send a signal to your hand, either accepting or rejecting that word. And you're doing it all in under 3/4 of a second. So it really is striking to students how efficient we are at processing when they've kind of done that and looked at the data in real time like this. The second thing, the thing that's of course more directly connected to our morphology unit, is look at the differences that we see across conditions, right? We see that as we get morphological complexity, or even the appearance of morphological complexity, it takes us longer. And so what we're seeing there is putting these rules to use. If every word were just stored separately, you wouldn't expect to see differences, right, between each of the conditions. It would just be a matter of like searching your lexicon and finding a match and then sending the signal, right? The fact that you're slower in the inflected cases tells us that we seem to be breaking things down. And so again, it's really striking to students to be able to run this on themselves, see the data, popped up right in front of them, and then have it kind of connected back to what we're doing in morphology. Okay, so how has the workshop met our goal here? It allows us to illustrate the real-time processing cost of morphological complexity, as well as the connection between the abstract theory and what we're doing when we're actually, reading and understanding words in real time. And students get to experience this for themselves because they're writing their own real-time data from the class. Again, lots of other examples across all of our workshops of how we connect to real world evidence. So we also do syntactic processing, real world dialect variation data, and spectrographic visualization of acoustic phonetic properties. Okay, Leslie is going to tell you about our third goal.
Okay, so our third goal is to introduce some practical skills for upper level linguistics courses and beyond. So as we know from teaching, linguistics research utilizes a lot of different concrete skills, not all of which are always explicitly taught. And we found in our workshops in particular that many students are struggling with some basic computer skills that we didn't even know were an issue until we started asking them explicitly to do them. So the workshops really provide this perfect opportunity to introduce these skills explicitly and then to practice them for linguistics courses. So for the example workshop, we're going to look at sociolinguistic data collection. This workshop is all about using a rapid and anonymous survey method to connect social variables out there in the real world to linguistic variables that we want to study in class. So the workshop is introducing the idea of sociolinguistics and sort of data collection, all the ethical considerations that come with it, but also because we have an eye to those skills, we're really doing a lot with Excel in terms of manipulating and interpreting the data. So here's our example. We're doing this data collection with rapid and anonymous surveys, and that involves students actually working outside of the workshop. So this is the only workshop that we have where students have any outside component beyond the 50-minute section. In the week before, they'll be recording responses that they get whenever they say thank you or thanks. And so that will give them various variants such as you're welcome or no problem. And they'll be recording those along with the social variable, which is the perceived age, in nice large ranges for students to estimate. And we do go into the fact that this is a perception, so it's not the actual social identity of the person, but in order to keep things anonymous, we don't ask that question. So this allows us to talk a little bit about ethical considerations in doing research with humans, about what we're asking, what we're not asking, and why. During the pandemic, I should add that we simply recycled data from past semesters rather than asking students to actually have interactions in person. So once we've got the data into the workshop section, then we'll start asking students to manipulate it in Excel and introducing them to just some basic different things that they can do with data in a spreadsheet. So for instance, sorting the variables or creating pivot tables. These are illustrations from our instructions. We found it's very, very helpful for students to be given an explicit idea of what they're aiming for so that they can know what it looks like when they've arrived at the correct kind of table. We also have them work with graphs and we have them produce many more example graphs than you'd actually need to report the results in order for us to be able to ask questions like, which is a better graph, the one that we did of the raw data or a proportional graph? that we do. And so students can think through the process themselves of what's the best way to represent data. So this workshop has met our goals of introducing some practical skills from basic computer skills through working with Excel and also some sociolinguistic skills along the way. We have other examples of workshops that are going to introduce practical skills. So everything from pivot tables to prot, depending on the workshop. So when we're talking about these workshops in this presentation, we've been using one example per goal, but I think all of the workshops are really going to be fulfilling multiple goals. So for instance, that language acquisition workshop that Kate was talking about first was to illustrate how to better represent the field, but it's also connecting to our morphology units, and it's introducing our real world skills like using corpus analysis.
And I'm just going to quickly jump in to say that we're just about coming up to the 20-minute mark. So I want to invite attendees to start adding questions into the Q&A session while our presenters finish up over the next couple minutes.
Right. So student feedback has been pretty positive, especially as we have gotten these fully running. So students are saying that workshops are interesting, they introduce helpful skills, they give a deeper understanding of the lecture course content, and also the whole range of the field of linguistics, which is a positive for us. So some sample student comments are that it's a highlight, that they enjoy applying what they're learning, and everyone's favorite comment that they've learned more about Excel in our class than they have in their accounting course. So some long-term implications for doing the workshops along with our intro course is that it allows us to be a really strong general education course that looks good administratively. It also means that students come into our upper level courses more prepared. So in my sociolinguistics courses, for example, I can ask students to create pivot tables and graphs without having to teach them that skill. Our research students become more prepared, so that that's good for us as faculty advisors that we have students who are so prepared, but it also means that students who might never have envisioned themselves as linguistic researchers have already practiced these skills and realized that this is something they themselves can do. So in conclusion, we feel that our workshop is fulfilling our 3 goals of better representing the field, connecting concepts to real world evidence, and introducing practical skills for upper level linguistics and beyond. And we've seen some really positive outcomes. Again, feel free to email Kate if you want any of our workshop materials. And thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Kate and Leslie. We're going to go ahead into some questions and answers. A reminder again to put those questions that you have into the Q&A session, not into the chat. So a question from Jessica. Thank you for this interesting presentation. I apologize if I missed this, but are these workshops mandatory for students or optional? And are they graded in any way for attending or participating in the workshop? Or is the purpose entirely for them to be able to practice these skills without it being graded?
Yeah, great question. They're required. So the way that it's encoded in our system is that it is a mandatory co-requisite 0 credit class. So similar to the way that a lot of other labs are encoded, they don't get access to register for it until they've registered for a section. And then once they register for a section, they register for a workshop section, and they have to do it to get credit for the class. The way that it's graded is that basically they get credit for doing it. So you've got to come, you've got to turn in the materials every week. There's like something to turn in, and it's not really graded for, correctness or incorrectness. We sort of go over all the answers at the end of the workshop anyway. The point is much more about being there and participating. I think this is something though that there's a lot of flexibility on. So in my summer course, for example, we don't have like an explicit workshop section, but I use some of these activities as like homework assignments, and then I might grade them differently. So not graded on content, just graded on participation for the most part, but you could do it differently.
And just to add in, we standardize across all sections that it's worth 10% of your grade. And we have a scale for workshops, number of workshops completed on time, 2 you can make up within a week, that sort of thing. And we do hire 2 undergraduate TAs to manage the, who's turned in which one, email people that you're missing a few workshops kind of thing that otherwise would be a little bit unwieldy.
Great. Chris asks, for an intro class, there are always tough choices about what to include or not include. When you incorporated workshops, what did you substitute out?
Yeah, great question. So again, this is maybe a little bit specific to our situation. And Anya, maybe you could talk more about this too, but I'll just say something brief, which is our intro course has always been a 4-credit course, but for the last 5 or so years, we only really had 3 contact hours. And so we were doing like a de-linked 4th credit anyway, for which we were doing kind of asynchronous documentary type content for a couple of years, and we were sort of unsatisfied with that. So for us, we didn't have to change at all what's in our sections because we continue to meet for 3 contact hours there. And so we really just got to like add a whole extra hour of content that we love and are excited about. But yeah, it would be trickier if we had to kind of sub out other things.
In the summer courses, which I think speaks to the next question too, in the summer courses, we don't have this extra hour because of the nature of summer teaching. So I just incorporate some, but not all of our 11 different workshops into the classroom teaching, and it works very well that way too.
So also, Kate, maybe you can speak to how you started. So we've run these, I think, 4 semesters now, but you ran them 2 or 3 semesters, pieces of them in your section. So maybe you could talk about some of the choices you made when you just
let's see. Did I make choice? I mean, I must have, because I started doing them at some point. When I was doing them in my section, I was only doing like a handful of the experimental ones. I just had this feeling that like, you know, in my research life, I'm conducting experiments and students leave my class and they don't know anything about conducting experiments in linguistics. And I felt like it was such a disconnect. So I started doing kind of 1 per unit, these sort of hands-on experiments. And it took about, 1 class day per thing. And I guess maybe I made something that had been an in-class activity, part of a homework or something, to swap that out. I don't remember exactly having to cut anything out necessarily, but yeah.
I guess, where you might have a problem set, like, work through phonology, morphology, what have you, problems in groups. You did the 50-minute activity, getting set up and having everyone go through it and going through the results and what turned out to be what we separated out so that everybody got that.
Yeah, that's right. And so, a lot of the things we're doing connect really directly to things we do in section anyway, right? So for example, the lexical decision task, it's like, yeah, maybe instead of, doing a couple extra morphology problems in class, you do that instead. And that's kind of another way to get it at sort of a deep thing about morphology. So yeah, exactly.
It also reduces time in other classes. So I was doing rapid and anonymous surveys as an out-of-class exercise in my mid-level sociolinguistics class, and now we do it in the workshop. And so I can take students to the next level of doing actually more in-depth, non-anonymous type sociolinguistic surveys. Or again, I can ask them to process the data in some ways and just post a reminder of, here are the instructions from that workshop you took. Remember how to do this, and please do it in this upper level class. So it's actually in some ways reduced the pressure in other courses to be teaching these things.
Great. So another question I'm going to kind of combine 2 here. So what do your assignments look like in a course like this? How has this changed the assignments that you give them? Could you talk about how the workshops fit in with summative assessments? Does the course include exams?
So the workshop component itself doesn't. Each of us run our section the way we want. So we have kind of a list of things that we cover, that we all cover in intro courses, but the way that we each implement that is different, and adding the workshops hasn't changed that at all. We've decided upon the 10%, and then students basically just get credit for showing up and doing the workshops. So in terms of like grading the workshop content, there's nothing that is universal sort of across all sections, and it hasn't necessarily taken away or changed anything that we do in the individual sections. Some of us, maybe I'm the only one who does this, but I occasionally have like an exam question or something that's about one of the workshops to kind of integrate it that way, but not required at all. As far as what students are actually turning in as far as assignments, so every day when they come into the workshop, they'll get basically a a little packet of instructions that has like step-by-step instructions to work through that week's activity. And then there's usually like a one-page document that's like something that you fill out, and they turn that in either by the end of the class or by some deadline a couple days later. I'm not sure, does that answer it?
And maybe just one other question. Do you feel that having a lab section may have scared away some students who might have otherwise taken the course? Is there an option to take the course without the lab?
We had a lot of discussion about this, so you can't take the course without the lab because the way our registration works. But we did think actually the opposite. We wanted students to realize that a course called Study of Language, Intro to Linguistics, which many of them have never heard of, is a really robust course with a lot of hard skills that they're using. So we wanted students not to think that this was an easy A, because it really isn't. We know linguistics has some good stuff to offer, and we wanted people to recognize that. Also, one of the reasons we called it a workshop was to mitigate anyone who thinks the word lab, which of course we use in linguistics, can only be used in a discipline like chemistry. So if people are expecting test tubes from the word lab, with workshop, maybe they're not. So it might mitigate a little bit of that, what does the lab mean for linguistics kind of factor for intro students.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I think that's about all the time we have for this presentation. If you have additional questions, feel free to continue to put those into the Q&A or the chat, and I'm sure the speakers would be willing to type in some more answers for you all. In the meantime, we'll move on to our last presentation, given by Gabriella Licata and Benjamin Papadopoulos from University of California, Berkeley, entitled Refuting Language Academy's Rejections of Non-Binary Grammatical Gender.
Great, thank you so much. So we'll be following up in a slightly different tone here. And before we begin, we just want to acknowledge the Ohlone peoples on whose native lands we have researched much of this presentation today. So it is estimated that about 25% of the world's languages have a system of masculine, feminine, morphological, or grammatical gender. The languages that you see here on your screen are spoken by an estimated 2.7 billion speakers. Now, this system presents obvious challenges for speakers who are non-binary or who do not otherwise identify with the gender binary. Now, this problem is largely solved by the innovation of the pronoun they in English. However, in languages with masculine, feminine gender, the complexities and distinctions of gender multiply tremendously. And besides the deep entrenchment of these gender categories in the grammar, innovative forms that are gender inclusive face extreme resistance from institutions of prescriptive language like la Real Academia Española, l'Académie Française, and l'Academia de la Crusca for Spanish, French, and Italian respectively, which we will take a look at today.
So why are we looking at academies in particular and not other institutions? Well, in Europe, these academies have quite a bit of power still today, but their roots are inherently tied to language and inherently tied language to territory. So we see them creating this idea of the nation state by tying land to language, and then also this imperial identity by leaving their traces of language in what we know today as countries that are not colonies, but still hold this kind of neo-colonial vibe from these academies, among other ideologies. So in the importance of the academies here is to see how they tie in with other structures of hegemonic power in the present day. And they insist that they are authorities on language and describe the common use of language, but we know that they really exist to prescribe and control the use of language, particularly in official capacities. And what we'll see today is how this works against the principles of sociolinguistics. So these are the three academies, as Ben mentioned, that we're looking at, and they vary in their amount of power and control over the language. For example, l'Académie Française is quite powerful and the official authority on language, where we see a bit more of a cultural reference to Academia de la Crusca, but again, they all are still very culturally important in their respective societies. So our goal today is to reveal how the Academy's resistance towards gender-fair language is emblematic of structural linguicism, but this linguicism is intertwined with other forms of discrimination. And this resistance to feminized and non-binary forms can be viewed as symbolic of their androcentric roots that continue to plague these academies.
Great. So before we get into the data, we just want to briefly describe some of the terminology that we'll use today. A lot of the logics that we'll look at today have origins in the feminist movements of the 70s and 80s in the US and abroad. So the first term, relatedly, is going to be linguistic sexism. So this was a term coined in that movement, and it basically encompasses the belief that there are structural or language internal social gender biases, regardless of how speakers use the language, that exist in the grammar. For instance, we can think of masculine generics. And this also includes the belief that masculine, feminine, morphological gender represents binary social gender categories encoded into language, particularly where people are referenced within the language. We have a term gender fair language, and this is sort of the highest level umbrella term that we could use to describe any non-prescriptive forms, linguistic forms, which work to erode the perceived biases above, including the addition of gender categories. And finally, we have anti-sexist or non-sexist language. And this is particularly for us, meaning that we are focused on the equal representation or visibility and significance or meaning of masculine and feminine forms within the extant constraints of the language. So we can see those anti-sexist reforms play out here in Spanish, French, and Italian with the top three kind of proposals to our eye. And those were the elimination of masculine generics by representing the masculine and feminine linguistic forms together in some way, the feminization of occupational titles with only prescriptively masculine forms, and recognition of feminine forms with derogatory meanings. Now, these are some of the terms that we'll use to move beyond the binary today, the first of which is gender-inclusive language. So this for us describes any linguistic innovations which are inclusive of all social genders, not just masculine and feminine genders. So by definition, these linguistic forms will be non-binary. Relatedly, we have a term non-binary language, and this is language which is literally not binary, so not masculine and not feminine grammatically, but this term is also used to designate forms which are advocated for use in the community with reference to specifically non-binary people only. By contrast, we have the term gender-neutral language, and this is language which is non-binary, but advocated for general use, so use with all subjects and where gender is unspecified. And we can see those sorts of innovations play out here amongst queer and non-binary gender-inclusive language reforms in the same three languages. And this is done basically with the innovation or the invention of gender-inclusive personal pronouns. So for instance, in Spanish, ella is quite popular. In French, yel and al are quite popular. And the innovation of gender-inclusive morphology. So those are the X and the A morphemes in Spanish and écriture inclusif in French.
In Italian, we don't yet have a consensus on either the pronouns or the morphology, especially with the pronouns that you can see, but we do see in writing, particularly popular, the use of the asterisk to represent this non-binary form. So our data corpus today are official statements from the three academies that offer any stances on anti-sexist or gender-inclusive language, including tweets and official statements on their websites. And using a decolonial queer lens, we extrapolate their stances on gender fair language based on whether they justify adopting or rejecting a reform. And using empirical linguistic studies and accepted sociolinguistic principles, we refute their rejections of both gender fair and gender inclusive language. But this corpus is by no means exhaustive, but we will provide some salient points.
Beginning with the Real Academia Española, which is the largest and most influential language academy governing the Spanish language. So we're going to take a look at some of their reactions from anti-sexist forms and then gender-inclusive forms for each academy one by one. So in a widely criticized and well-known 2012 El País article written by Ignacio Bosque and undersigned by 26 RAE members, the Academy asserts that the language itself is not sexist because of a few reasons that they perceive. So the first of which is that women, without consulting linguists, have promoted the use of anti-sexist language based on their own social consciousness, contradicting various grammatical laws, that women themselves do not feel excluded by the use of masculine generics, and that representations of linguistic gender need not correspond exactly with social gender. Now, Paz Bataner, who was a female RAE inductee in 2017, said that the issue was unimportant, and she characterized the Academy's approach as descriptivist, which is a position that they maintain. Now, as of January 2020, the RAE has indeed updated 366 diccionario entries to include some popularized feminized professional titles, relatedly removing male-specific language from their definitions, as you can see an example here. They have also accepted the use of masculine and feminine forms together, for instance, jueces y juezas, in limited circumstances for instance, were politically, legally, or socially pertinent. However, they have not accepted a great deal of these other feminist reforms. And they maintain that linguistic feminization in and of itself is largely unnecessary because the masculine gender is an unmarked or a default gender and can encompass all subjects just as it is. Okay, now let's take a look at some of their reactions to truly gender inclusive language. So RAI Informa is the RAI's Twitter account that has sent more than 470 tweets, which are official replies from the Academy, addressing gender fair Spanish forms by citing their own statutes and documents or inventing a different justification. So regarding specific innovations, nearly all of these tweets are rejections, as you've probably seen. So here's one that says inclusive language implies artificially altering Spanish gender morphology under a subjective premise of discrimination. And they say that the use of the letter X is supposedly alien to Spanish gender morphology, as well as unpronounceable and unnecessary because the masculine gender can do this. Relatedly, we saw most recently the pronoun ella was inducted into the RAI's Observatorio de Palabras, which is just a space to discuss neologisms in the Spanish language and a space for discussion. But it was there for just a few days before it was pulled entirely, and the RAI tweeted, due to the confusion generated by ella, it was deemed preferable to remove this entry. So we can see that even when we take steps closer to legitimization in the RAI, they sort of go back on their word in a way, in a number of ways.
So moving on to the French Academy, a 2014 statement on feminization of titles was very resistant to doing so. They first talk about not being able to change the rules, ordinary rules of derivation, and doing so would create barbarisms. And they use, the Academy tends to use very strong language. They also talk about the systematic feminization of titles as harming the genius of the French language and opening a period of linguistic uncertainty. So lots of doubt into speakers, where if we're only using the masculine form, there is no doubt, we know which one to use, and that's their stance there. And they also talk about the two genders, one of the two genders having to be chosen and given a generic value. So it's how do you make one of the genders generic when we already have described it as one gender? And also, and we'll see this with the other academies, that professional titles do not belong to the person. So this places doubt in when to feminize a title or when to feminize a word, period. So it really keeps the job or the function separate from the person. And this all comes back to a very strong statement that they made in 2014 about the French Academy being the only authority on language, and that they are the only ones who are allowed to change it, and that their expression of language is really tied to national sovereignty. In 2019, they changed their tune ever so slightly, but we'll see at the end that they really don't. They accept a number of feminized titles, and even one of their Academy members, an immortal, Dominique Bona, describes the Academy as having a marvelous spirit of openness in their acceptance of some feminized terms. And a lot of the times these feminized terms are kind of high society jobs, or what they would consider important or professional, not really thinking about maybe kind of trade jobs or your everyday job. And they again highlight linguistic constraints as the reason why this the feminization of language poses difficulty. And again, generalizing that women prefer the use of masculine anyway, without any data or any kind of proof. Coming up a bit later in 2017, we see the first textbook to include the use of inclusive writing in French teaching. Inclusive writing in France means equal representation of masculine and feminine forms. So the Academy had a very, very strong reaction to this. We see a lot of very flagrant language here. So they raise a solemn warning saying that basically language will be destroyed if this continues or if this is enacted in education. And they raise a cry of alarm that this inclusivity is an aberration to the French language, which finds itself in mortal danger. And also, again, tying this idea of language to nation state, the language and the country will find itself taken advantage of by other nations and languages. So France will lose its global power. And we see the ties here of hegemonic structures where the former French Prime Minister Edouard Philippe is in agreement with the L'Académie and issues a statement on Twitter, basically saying all students need to be learning the same thing, and which is the rule, and the rule is what the Academy decides. Moving on to La Crusca. So there are several statements on anti-sexist language, mainly the feminization of titles. So we see in the beginning a very similar tune to how L'Académie started out by saying that, you know, this is very linguistically challenging, but there are kinds of social implications. This is a delicate subject, the feminization of titles, which is an interesting adjective to use. And that people just aren't used to it. So if people aren't used to it and it's just something that we're doing to be politically correct, then there's going to be backlash. There's going to be marginalization. And again, they mention that women often, in several statements, women often prefer the masculine forms. So the tune changes a bit in 2013, where we have Cecilia Robustelli, who's a linguist and affiliate of the La Crusca, talk about the social side of all this. And she's really the first one to do this in all of the academies, where she talks about women being hidden inside the masculine grammatical gender. She mentions androcentricity as being the reason why, and really attributes all this to linguistic attitude. The subjective, this uncertainty in the face of the feminization of titles really lends to the subjective judgments here, that feminine forms are ugly, that the masculine can be used safely to reference women when we know that that's not true, otherwise this wouldn't be an issue. So she really stresses the cultural side of this. The Crusca and gender inclusive statements, we have none to date. And this really demonstrates the kind of the lack of coherent non-binary systems in Italy thus far.
Great, so with that in mind, we're now going to extrapolate some general premises or claims made by the academies and one by one go through exactly why we are refuting them today. So the first is that masculine feminine linguistic gender is arbitrary and unrelated to social gender. The second is that innovative forms are linguistically invalid, and relatedly that their evaluative judgments about language are to be taken as factual. That gender inclusivity is only about women, and that accepting gender-fair language would somehow cause speakers to be discriminated against, rather it being the academies that perpetuate this discrimination. So the first claim that we'll sort of take a look at today briefly is that masculine feminine linguistic gender is arbitrary. So this is luckily a very easy claim for us to refute. It's backed by a number of empirical studies in linguistics, and it's refuted by historical evidence, primarily here in a book by Anthony Corbile entitled Sexing the World. This author describes Greek and Roman grammarians' adoption of the terms masculine and feminine to represent the linguistic categories. He describes the patriarchal justification of the use of the masculine gender as the default by grammarians claiming males as the better sex, and the interchanging usage of the terms genus, meaning type or species, and sexus, meaning sex, in Latin grammars, which sort of points to their conflation of the concepts. Now, this is also a claim that is refuted by a number of empirical studies in psycholinguistics, in which we see associations of linguistic gender with social gender produced by speakers just based on the categories themselves. And we see interpretations of masculine generics amongst many, many speakers. When they see a masculine form that is supposedly representing a lot of people, all they picture are men. And this is a well-attested phenomenon in psycholinguistics. Now, most interestingly, this claim is refuted by the academies themselves. So on this slide, you'll see here 3 different definitions, but largely the same, from the academies' dictionaries or grammars. And you can see here that every single one of the definitions says that linguistic gender corresponds with the biological distinction of the sexes. So in this case, they are kind of conflating sex as binary and gender as binary. And a very interesting thing happens. So when the academies reject non-binary grammatical gender, through these definitions and through this association, it can be explicitly understood that what they are simultaneously doing is rejecting non-binary social gender. Now, the second claim that we'll go over is that innovative forms are linguistically invalid. But yet we know that linguistic innovations and borrowings of all types are natural processes that have been attested for decades in sociolinguistics. Interestingly, almost all feminized forms in Spanish, French, and Italian are based on extant gender morphemes and extant inflectional processes. And even many innovative gender-inclusive morphemes are based on characters that come from within the orthographic inventory of the language as it is already, and they have attested phonological representations based on extant sounds in the language, like chiques and personas in Spanish. And if they don't come from extant orthographic or inventory or sound, that is also a natural process that's been attested for decades in sociolinguistics. Negative evaluative judgments about linguistic forms are not factual, and we know that these evaluations are part of a broader process of social and structural linguistic discrimination. So when we say that non-binary linguistic forms are invalid, what is simultaneously being said is that non-binary social gender is somehow also invalid. You're on mute.
Sorry about that. Moving on to gender inclusivity being only about women, which is a stance that we saw just in, even if only in the Italian examples where they don't talk about inclusivity. We see a very structuralist interpretation of sex, gender with language expression. We know that sex and gender are not the same thing, and that we know that neither are binary nor inherent. Gender is performed, and we've seen this reiterated in many studies, especially many linguistic studies. But through this decolonial feminist and queer theory lens, we are able to resolve that rigid binarity, which the academies are not doing. And we are able to undo that conflation of sex and gender. Feminist and queer movements are disjointed in many of these cultures. So we still see in recent decades a focus on the feminization of titles, just as recent as statements coming out this past year. So we're trying to separate women from men. We're trying to understand masculine forms from feminine forms, but this lacks an intersectional perspective. And what it's doing really is it's kind of understanding, or it's not understanding very deeply androcentricity and patriarchy as plaguing many people, many groups, many communities, not just women and not just white women, which often is who we see as the idealized image of these feminist movements in Europe. And to that end, we see a disconnect between academies and academia. And within academia, we see a disconnect of feminist and queer movements. And in particular, in Italy, I just heard a presentation on this, where they're not working together and there's not this coherent movement against the patriarchy. Moving on to the last point, the last stance, which is that gender fair language causes discrimination. We see that the academies rely on a positivist framework of linguistic gender, which then makes it difficult to include non-binary forms. They say we can't do that because that doesn't exist in our language, but that doesn't explain how they've resisted feminized forms for so long. Women, this is not the first, women are not suddenly working in these countries. They've been working for a long time, and they actually were the providers during World War II in many of these cultures, many of these countries, and that was seen as temporary. So this issue was kind of went away, but it came back in the 70s and 80s as these movements took hold. Academies blame language for ensuing discrimination, not colonial power, of dynamics of society that govern discrimination within discourse and within public and private spheres. So you can not feminize your title and be misgendered, or you can feminize your title and be marginalized. It's this notion that Laura Ben-Lakoff always touches on. And then we look at kind of how Rosa and Flores talk about appropriateness in the classroom, and through a ratio-linguistic lens, we can understand how appropriateness is also one of the many tenets of standardized forms that the academies maintain. So if speakers are using inappropriate forms, those speakers are also just deemed inappropriate in their social sphere. So we see language as a proxy for marginalization of communities in these public spaces, but language is not the discriminating factor. It's really, language is pointing, indexing the underlying semiosis of that culture.
I'm just going to quickly jump in to say we're just at about the 20-minute mark. So while the presenters finish up, I want to invite attendees to enter in questions into the Q&A.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just going back to this, one quick point, we also see this consistent academy stance that women don't mind the masculine form. They're fine with it. But there would be no reason to feminize if women felt okay with it. Maybe some women are fine with the masculine form, and there are many reasons to use it. But it's this kind of blanket assumption that they're fine. So we see so much fear mongering here. We see a lot of language panic that that feminization of titles causes the linguistics, or causes people to go into panic. What do we say? How do we refer to ourselves? How do I refer to this person? It causes everyone to question. And we saw this in the 2016 mayoral election in Rome, where the first woman won in 2,000 years of history of Rome, won the election. And it was a huge controversy. What do we call her? And it's still a debate. So we see this furthers social discrimination, because gender is inherently or brought into the conversation. Gender's indexed even when women are trying not to index it. And then we see this systemic language subordination. And so if we see this with women, and we still continue to see this with women in these societies, we're going to see it even more so with those who ascribe to a non-binary form of expression. And in this sense, we see that structural linguicism, going back to this point, is surface level. However, it's intertwined with other deeply rooted forms of discrimination. AKA gender discrimination, but also racism when we take that intersectional lens that is very necessary. So, sorry, it's getting sticky here. So we call on the academies to recognize the importance of access to anti-sexist and gender inclusive language as an inherently humanitarian issue.
The truth is that gender nonconforming speakers around the world lack access to information about this language, and it is partially due to their delegitimization by language academies. So we urge the academies, if they are as descriptivist as they say they are, to collaborate with communities who have originated this language and academics who understand intersectional feminist theory to sort of collaborate in coming to a way to accept this language, to sort of enter it into the hegemonies and give people access to it. So with that, we'd like to say thank you so much for attending our session today. We have these slides with even more information than we were able to present today on our websites, and we'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much to both of you. There is a sort of request in the Q&A so far. This is wonderful. Thank you. During the Q&A, could you show the slide with your definitions of the different kinds or levels of gender aware or supportive language, gender fair, etc.?
Yeah, let me go back to it so I'm not.
Yeah, so what we're talking about today kind of comes from two different movements in time. So we have the feminist movement of the 70s and 80s, and this really took off in the case of Spanish and French. And that is where we get the anti-sexist kind of terminology. So that is really just referring to the feminization of language, which worked within the extant constraints of the language, and nothing about what they were doing was particularly innovative in the sense that we got new morphemes or new inflectional processes, except in the case of Italian maybe. And then we are sort of moving ahead to a different moment in time where we have queer and non-binary activists discussing gender inclusive language, which we take to mean language that is inclusive of more genders than just male and female genders. So in this way, we have a different set of terminology that we're using to sort of describe non-binary innovations, which truly are innovations or inventions, because very few prescriptive options exist to express gender neutrality in masculine, feminine, gender languages. And that is kind of the problem.
Great. The next question. This refutation of academicians against gender inclusive language is excellent. Is the next step to turn this into some kind of statement that could be presented to each of the academies? And if so, is this something that more linguists or organizations could sign on to?
Yeah, I think that what needs to happen, and I think the issue here is that this is a topic that we're talking about really widespread here in the US. And I think that people are talking about it in Europe, but I don't know what the unity is, again, between the queer and feminist movements. So I think that it's very possible to, I mean, this will turn into a paper, but to kind of create, again, a call to the academies and have people sign it. But I think there needs to be a bit of, I do have some collaborators in Europe that are working on gender fair language or gender inclusive language. So it's a matter of kind of getting that unity among European institutions that I think will be vital. But there is a lot of loyalty to these institutions, to these academies from many, even linguists. So I think we'll have to see what happens there.
Another question. I love to see this discussion around gender fair language. I'm curious to know how the asterisk is pronounced for the Italian examples given near the beginning of the presentation.
Great question.
Yeah, that's a good question. They're not. Yeah.
So
yeah, not. I mean, as far as we know, they're not. So I think oftentimes it's they are read just probably in the masculine form, but. Yeah, that is the issue, and there is the issue with Italian really is the lack of where is that? The lack of vowels available. So this U here is often often the unstressed O in a lot of regional languages in Italy. So when I hear that U at the end of a word, I think masculine because that's what that means in my regional language. And the schwa is very difficult to pronounce at the end of a word, at least for me, and I know others. So, but it is possible for some speakers of like Sicilian and other languages. So this is really what they have right now that is most widespread and is not pronounceable at the moment.
We have a question from Julia Nee, who's our tech monitor. She doesn't have access to the Q&A, so I'll let her unmute and ask.
Sure.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you so much for this presentation. I was wondering if you had any specific suggestions for either language teachers or people maybe teaching introduction to linguistics about what takeaways you would want people to share.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Julia. Well, we want people to understand that the authority that these academies claim to have or hold is really just influence, and that there is no law of sociolinguistics that says that a language must have an authority. In fact, it is speakers individually who have their own linguistic agency and linguistic self-determination to use these inclusive forms, to popularize them, and then to enter them from the bottom up into hegemonic structures of power. So we think a lot of conversation around the academies is kind of part of their mystique to create this illusion, especially in the case of l'Académie Française, which is quite vitriolic towards gender inclusive language, to sort of break down some of the logics behind what they say and sort of extrapolate the fact that these authorities are not so much bound by laws. If that makes sense.
And also, I think providing, I mean, this isn't a linguistics class that I was teaching, but in my Spanish class, I provide students with a chart of all the gender inclusive personal pronouns, but also alongside the pronouns that they learn in the book, just so they see that these are legitimate forms. And I tell them you can use these or not. I also, which is very much against my department policy, I don't grade down if people mix their morphemic endings to describe themselves. I tell them I don't care because the expression is there. So I think just having an open mind to how people can express themselves. But in linguistics, I think just giving students resources, I think is useful, particularly depending on what language they work in. And encouraging them to explore if forms exist within the language that they're interested in.
We're a little over time, but we just have one question left in the Q&A, so I think we'll go ahead and take that. Are there writing systems that differ from spoken forms in all three languages? I know French also uses a median point, and that is unpronounced.
Yeah, consensus is really out about what to do in the case of French, but we definitely see different things going on. So like Gabby touched on, we have in Italian, the U would be the fifth morpheme in the paradigm. So that is kind of working at a loss of vowels. Like in the gender and number paradigm, we have 4 vowels already being used out of 5.
Mm-hmm.
So in some languages, the constraints really vary a lot. And then you have attestations here in brackets and IPA of things that we have attestations for. And then the others, there is no consensus out about them. And so this is something that is very exciting for our research to sort of see what happens in time.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much to our last two presenters. This has been an awesome panel. And thank you all so much for attending, and enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thanks,
Thank you
everyone.
all.